He is a Franco-American cognitive scientist. It's very exciting. His talk is called Science and the Soul. His hiding place when he was a kid, he didn't like certain foods, he didn't like certain meats and stuff, and under his kitchen table, keeping the table up were these two sort of tubes that were part of the design of the table, but he realized he could remove one of the caps from the tubes, and he would stuff meat into the tube, and he would replace the cap, and it wasn't for years until they realized that he had been doing that. So that's a pretty damn good hiding spot, I would say. His favorite candy is Toblerone. Excellent one. Shower, preferable. He had two names for his boat, and we couldn't quite decide which one. One was the Beagle, which I think is a very good name, of course. And the other one, some of you might get this, some of you might not. Slice of Life was the other name. You got it. All right. That's a Dexter reference, if you don't get that one. And the question he wanted to ask that he would get the answer to is, where does Lawrence Krauss get his shoes? That was the question. So please welcome Julien Musolino.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really, really love attending events like this one. So I want to thank the organizers for putting this event together. I attended some really wonderful talks over the last couple of days. And I'd like to thank you all for being here today on a Sunday to attend a talk on what happens after you die. So to set the stage for this presentation, I'm going to start by showing you a very short video clip that beautifully captures the main idea that I'm going to be talking about today. So notice that I brought my own clicker, and it works. So yeah, I teach, so I know. So let's watch and listen. Pretty clever ad. So if anybody's driving back today, please make sure you buckle up. I'm in heaven, can indeed wait. In fact, I feel like I'm in heaven right now with all these lights on me, just white light and tunnel light. So this raises the question of the soul. You saw these translucent shapes ascend probably into heaven or into hell, possibly. So who believes in the soul today? What kind of soul do people actually believe in? Why do we believe in the soul? It's been a long, long time since people have had such beliefs. Why is that? Why are we prone to such beliefs as human beings? Does science have anything to say about the question of the soul? That's a key question for us skeptics and free thinkers. And if so, what can we learn about the soul from science? I'm a cognitive scientist. I study these questions. I study how the mind works. So these are fascinating questions to me. And what are the implications? What if science tells us one way or the other? What follows from what we can learn from science about such questions? And of course, why should anyone care? Why is this important? Why should we talk about this publicly? Why should I actually teach courses in which I discuss some of these issues. So why does it matter? All these questions are questions I discuss in my recent book, The Soul Fallacy, which is not here today, but you can purchase it on Amazon if you would like, or in bookstores around the state, around the country. And since we're not too far from Hollywood here, what I thought I would do today is give you a sneak preview of the main ideas that I develop in the book. Now, I want to express this caveat that there are a lot of ideas that I discuss in the book, and they're fascinating questions. So I'm only going to touch on the tip of the iceberg today, but I'd be delighted to talk to you. I'm going to be around today in the hallways, having dinner, drinks, and I'd love to chat with you about the rest of the issues, those that I can't really discuss, given that I have a limited amount of time. So what I'm going to do is start giving you the main claims that I'm going to make, and then I'm going to show you why I think these claims are likely to be true. The first claim is that the traditional soul, which I will define in a moment, is not just a theological or religious or metaphysical claim, but it is above all a scientific claim. And that consequently we can determine the existence of the soul in an objective manner, the way we decide the age of the earth and other questions like that. You'll be shocked to know, I'm sure, that science gives us every reason to believe that human beings do not have souls of the traditional kind that we'll discuss in just a few moments. This conclusion, it turns out, has implications that extend far beyond the realm of science and into the realm of society, issues that should be of concern to all of us, in fact. And there's a positive message with which I want to end, which is that we have nothing to lose by letting go. I mean, not us. I'm assuming not many people here in this crowd believes in the soul, but I'm talking about us more generally, that we don't have anything to lose, but in fact that we have something important to gain, all of us as a society, by letting go of these ideas. So these are the claims, and here's how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to start by giving you some background, then I'm going to talk about science and the soul, and I'm going to flesh out some of the implications of these ideas, and then I'm going to give you a sense of the road ahead. So let's begin with some background. If you look at what people believe in the U.S. is an unusually religious country given how wealthy we are. And these are polls from different years not too long ago from different polling organizations that show that an overwhelming majority of Americans, 70, 80%, believe in some version of the afterlife or heaven or the survival of the soul after death. When you drive around the country, I don't know if you've seen these billboards. They're called gospelbillboards.com or .org, and they have quite a few of them. I called the number once, 855 for truth. I can tell you what happened. It's was very interesting. So after you die, you will meet God. Well, of course, you is your soul. Your body is not functioning anymore after you die. So you see this, and we live in a country where religious beliefs are advertised as aggressively as fast food and prescription drugs. If you go to bookstores, you'll find a lot of books that claim that there is evidence, sometimes even scientific evidence, for the soul narrative. So Proof of Heaven was a big bestseller. Ibn Alexander, the former Harvard neurosurgeon. Life After Death, The Evidence, Dinesh D'Souza. 90 Minutes in Heaven. I can actually have 20 more slides showing you all the books that claim that there is evidence for the soul. Now, I teach cognitive science, cognitive psychology at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where I do research too, and I got interested a few years ago in what my own students would think. After all, there are people who are educated, they're exposed to our classes in neuroscience, in psychology, in cognitive science, and I can assure you that we do not teach them anything about the soul. It's all about the brain. So what would they think? So I devised a simple scale where I asked them whether they believed they had a soul, on a scale from 1 to 6. So 1 is definitely not, and 6 is definitely yes, with values in the middle. And I went on and asked them a number of additional questions, of course. So how would you define the concept of a soul? In other words, what is your soul? And I give them a number of options. An immaterial entity that is separate from your body, a metaphor for the activity of your brain, and so on and so forth. And I did this a number of times with a number of groups, both in the classroom as an assignment. I brought students into the lab. I had honor students do an experiment with me one semester, and the results came out pretty much the same, very robust replication. So I just want to show you with one sample of close to 200 students a few years ago, and much to my surprise, 80% of the students in my own class picked a value between 4 and 6, with half of those picking the value 6. And when they had to answer the question, what do you think your soul is, they gave the very traditional answer, most of them. said that it was an immaterial entity separate from their body. I can tell you more. I mean, you can ask me if you'd like during the question session, but we asked them many more questions like where did it come from, who gave it to you, what couldn't you do if you didn't have a soul, etc., etc. Moreover, these people, these students, would tell you that their soul didn't just sit there and do nothing, but gave them psychological powers. So, gave them a moral compass, gave them consciousness, gave them feeling, gave them free will, their personality, their ability to make decisions. So if we put all this together, what we learn from the books that we read, where people tell us that we have souls, and here's the evidence, from the surveys that we get, either the broad surveys or the more fine-grained ones like the experiments that I do, we can come up with a rather precise notion or definition of a soul. And that soul that most people believe in today in the US and around the world has three key properties. The first is that it's believed to be immaterial or non-physical. The second is that it's believed to be what I call psychologically potent. It gives you something of a psychological nature. It gives you your personality, it gives you free will, it gives you a moral compass. And of course, the third one is it's immortal. It carries your consciousness into the afterlife so you can recognize grandma in heaven. So that's the kind of soul that I'm going to be talking about. That's what I call the traditional soul. Now, is this the only kind of soul one can think of? Of course not. You can think of a soul as a metaphor. You can think of a soul as something completely different. But that's the kind of soul that most people, including students who take classes in psychology and neuroscience, happen to believe in still today in the 21st century. Now, if you turn to denizens of the ivory tower, people like me who live in academia and work in academia, this is not at all what we think. And if you read what we publish, published papers, you'll see that we're quite explicit about it. So this is Joshua Green, who's a cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard. You heard earlier people mention the trolley problem. He's worked a lot on the trolley problem. If I can suggest a great book that he wrote, it's called Moral Tribes. It's one of the best books on morality. Warmly recommend it. So here's what Josh said. He said most people are dualists. Most people being most non-scientists. Dualist means that there's a duality, so body and soul, right? Intuitively, we think of ourselves not as physical devices, but as immaterial minds or souls housed in physical bodies. We scientists take the mind's physical basis for granted. Among the general public, it's a touchy subject. If you look now at data on what scientists believe, this was mentioned, I think, yesterday in one of the talks. This is a poll that was published in Nature in 1998, a three-time period. So the question here is not so much belief in God, they tested that too, but it's belief in human immortality, so belief in the soul narrative. You see that at the turn of the 20th century, you have roughly a third of, these are elite scientists, by the way, members of the National Academy of Sciences, very impressive scientists. You see that about a third believed in human immortality or the soul narrative. Now watch what happens as the 20th century unfolds. This is 1933, and this is still a couple decades ago. This is 1998. That's that famous 7% that you heard about yesterday. Why not 0%? That's an interesting question. But still it shows that as you get better and better as a scientist, you believe in this narrative less and less, and 90-something% is a strong, that's pretty much the number of scientists, or climate scientists, who believe in the consensus on climate change. So it's a really big consensus. So there are two different worldviews that people hold. If you're not a scientist, if you're not a member of the ivory tower, then you're very likely to be a dualist of kind. So you're going to think that we are part beast, part angel. Right? So we have a body and we have a soul. They're sort of attached here, as you can see, but they can, of course, detach. On the other hand, if you're a working scientist, you're going to espouse a form of materialism. Now, I have a picture of the Terminator there, because, not because we're programmed to kill Sarah Connor, but because what's really wonderful about the Terminator, if you watch the movies, is it's a machine, and it seems to act just like a human being. It can talk, it can walk, it can reason, it can scheme, it can do all kinds of things. And yet we know it even seems to be conscious. There's something it is like to be a Terminator. You see red parameters floating in front of your field of vision. And yet we know it's a machine. It's physical through and through. There's nothing immaterial or anything like that about the Terminator. So according to modern science, we are biological versions of the Terminator. We don't have a metallic endoskeleton, of course, but we're biological versions of the Terminator. We're physical through and through. We don't have a vapor, an aura, a soul, or whatever, spirit. So now you might say, okay, great, who cares? Who cares about these two worldviews? Who cares whether people are dualists or materialists? It sounds like a philosophical debate. But it turns out that the worldview that you hold has important implications for the kinds of decisions that you make that affect the rest of us. It matters, for example, as I'm sure you know, in the endlessly rehash debate over abortion that we experience every election cycle. It matters for, these are not stem cells, by the way, but it matters for questions of stem cell research. It matters for what happens at the end of life, whether or not we should have the right to die with dignity. Physician-assisted suicide. Turns out that whether you're a dualist or a materialist has implications for that question. And I'm very happy that we heard a really wonderful talk on Saturday by Diane Goldstein. Is that right? Yes? Who was a law enforcement officer who talked about how dysfunctional our criminal justice system is here in the US. Well, it turns out, and I'm really glad she gave this wonderful presentation, because what I'm going to say at the end really dovetails with what she said from a different perspective, albeit I haven't been in law enforcement my entire life. I've been in academia my entire life. But it turns out that whether you're a dualist or materialist has implications for how you view human action and moral responsibility, and therefore what we should do to punish bad behavior. So that's the background. Let me talk to you now about what science has to say about the soul. One of the questions I asked the students in my survey is whether they thought that the question of whether we have a soul is a question that can be answered objectively, at least in principle, and thus one that can be answered using scientific means. The overwhelming response, at least from those who believed in the soul, was no. You see, Professor, it's a religious question. It's a metaphysical question. Science can't touch it. There's some interesting work being done on this kind of response. I'm going to skip for now. But of course, that's just not true. If you think about the nature of the claim, it's obvious that it is a scientific claim, and that's for two main reasons. The first is what I call detachability and autonomy of function. If you claim that the mind or consciousness can operate outside the confines of the body, you're making a testable scientific claim. If, for example, it were possible to talk to the dead, you know the joke, it's easy to talk to the dead, it's hard for them to talk back to you. But if it were possible to talk to the dead when you're holding Uncle Fred's ashes in an urn right here in your hand, and you know the body has ceased to function, you'd have really good evidence that consciousness continues to function independently from the body. In fact, I could design an experiment with a few undergrads in my lab under control conditions that could test for that and pocket the $1 million that James Randi, I don't know if it's still going, I think Lawrence has $1 million to give now to people, I heard. So I'll pocket that. Yeah, he's pulling out his checkbook right now. So that's one way in which there could very easily be evidence. When people claim that they have so-called out-of-body experiences and that their soul is floating about in the hospital room, there are people, clever scientists, who put laptops on top of cabinets with certain displays on the laptops. The displays were placed in such a way that the physical body of the person could not possibly see from their restricted vantage point what was on the laptop. But if your soul was floating around, imagine that upon regaining consciousness, the person were to faithfully, pun intended, recite what was on the screen. And suppose you could replicate this, then under controlled conditions. Then you would have pretty good evidence that consciousness and the mind and cognition can happen independently of the body. So that's the first reason why it is a scientific claim. There could be evidence that the world works like that. The second reason has to do with physics. Because remember, the soul doesn't just sit there and look pretty. In fact, you can't see it, so it can't look pretty. But it actually does something of a psychological nature. Right? It gives you free will, moral compass. What this means is that that immaterial stuff, whatever that means, has to be able to causally interact with the elementary particles in your brain to make you do what you do, make you think what you think. And anything that interacts with the elementary particles in your brain is a claim about physics. And physicists know a thing or two and have theories about the behavior of elementary particles that are very well developed, both mathematically and experimentally. So if you are a soul believer, you also are making a claim about physics. So the soul claim then is a scientific claim. We can turn it into two competing hypotheses. The first one is the dualistic hypothesis that human beings are composed of a physical body and an immaterial, psychologically potent, and immortal soul. That's the soul that we just defined earlier, based on what people tell us. But body and soul are distinct entities on this view, and the soul can continue to exist and function independently from the body after we die. That's the dualistic view. I could show you, I don't have time, but I could show you an analogy. If you ask me, I can give you that. By contrast, the materialistic hypothesis is that the mind, the domain of the modern soul, the soul in fact has a history that I can tell you about later, the mind cannot function separately from the body, for the simple reason that our mental experiences, our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, are caused by physical activity in our brains and bodies. This is going to sound obscure, but I can show you what this means later. What we call mind is nothing but a description of the functioning of the brain at a certain level of abstraction. That's a supremely important idea that is not very well understood outside of scientific circles. Body and mind are therefore two sides of the same coin. Now notice that these two hypotheses are mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. Either we have a soul or we don't. There's no in between. So the question is, which one is more likely to be true? And how can we decide? Well, it's not hard to think conceptually about how we can decide. It's the same way we can decide whether the earth is flat or round. Now, we look at what each model predicts, and we look at how the world is, that we do science, basically. And then science tells us what the world is most likely to look like. And, in spite of valiant efforts by flat earthers, we still believe if you have a sane constitution, that the earth is round and not flat. So, same approach to decide whether materialism, as I defined it in this presentation, or dualism is more likely to be true. And when you do that, what you find is that all the evidence points towards materialism. It's a bit like you heard a talk about evolution. Scientists have a high degree of confidence in evolution because of converging lines of evidence, right? From the fossil record, from molecular biology, from comparative anatomy, it all points in the same direction. That's what philosophers of science call consilience of evidence, when the evidence all points in the same direction. That's exactly what you have in the case of materialism. All the evidence points towards materialism and away from dualism. In fact, if we look at it, so I really wish I had a few more hours to speak with you, so I could detail each, because it's fascinating. The history and the science is absolutely fascinating. But I don't have the luxury of time, so I'm just going to mention the bullet points. You can make mental notes if you'd like, and then we can chat about that when I'm done. But the first thing is that the soul, it turns out, has shrunk as scientific understanding has progressed. So there used to be different kinds of souls a few thousand years ago. There were life souls and body souls and ego souls. And as we've made scientific progress, those souls have sort of gone away. And now we only have one, the soul, that's supposed to perform mental functions. What this strongly suggests is that souls are attempts on the part of our pre-scientific ancestors to answer biological and psychological questions about which they had no clue. So they invoked souls, also because we have a penchant for certain kinds of explanation. And so souls really, if you hear the word soul, think label for our ignorance. That's what it means. It's, I don't know how it works, I'm going to call this the soul. That's really what happened historically. And as our ignorance decreased, I won't go into this because I know, yes, I won't go into this. But it's really fascinating. So that's the first line against the soul. There is, look, magic, no formalism that describes the operation of the soul. That's very important. We scientists like to have formalism. The great Isaac Newton was really puzzled and unhappy about his discovery that you can have action at a distance, because he was reintroducing occult forces in science. And the Descartes and his predecessors introduced the mechanical philosophy, according to which everything had to work on contact. And here's Newton saying, look, forget about contact. You can have this arbitrary action at an arbitrary distance, instantaneous. He was deeply puzzled by that. And he wrote about it. So you might say, well, if Newton proposed, and he even, if you read the Principia, he even said, well, look, whether that agent, that gravity, is material or immaterial, I'll let my readers decide. So you might say, gee, if Newton proposed maybe some immaterial force, why not propose a soul? Yes, but Newton had equations. All right? You know the famous laws of motion, the law of gravitation, and those equations allow people to make very good predictions, and that's why Newtonian mechanics came to replace the Cartesian kind. There's no such thing for the soul. There's no soul equations that can predict what people are going to do, what they're going to say, and how they're going to behave. That's a huge problem. There's no objective empirical evidence that supports the existence of the soul, but there could be, but there isn't. Souls fly in the face of everything we know about modern science. They fly in the face of physics. They fly in the face of what we know about evolution. There's no explanatory gain that comes from postulating the existence of the soul. So try, for example, this. Consciousness, as you know, is mysterious. We don't really understand how it works, at least a certain aspect of it. Now try this. I tell you, the soul does it. Now ask yourself, do you understand consciousness better? No, you don't, right? Saying the soul does it explains nothing. And finally, there's overwhelming evidence supporting the materialistic alternative. So the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist. And that's why modern scientists have abandoned it. All right? So you might say, but what about the evidence that people claim exists in all these books? Remember we had a talk about con artists earlier today? Here's the trick they play. I don't know if they're aware of it or not, but the trick that they invariably play works something like this. If you think of all the things that we can call evidence, there's tons of things. Is there evidence that the Earth is stationary? Absolutely. The way we feel right now. Doesn't feel like we're moving around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour, does it? So here's evidence that the Earth is stationary. So it's not. We're moving around. Lawrence will tell you, we're moving around the sun, okay? But just don't get me wrong. So those people say, oh, look, there's evidence for the soul. But what they invariably do not tell you is that we have to distinguish between evidence and scientifically acceptable evidence. That's a big difference. And when you restrict your attention to what is scientifically acceptable, there's no evidence. And of course, everybody isn't a trained scientist, so people sometimes can't tell the difference between what's scientifically acceptable and what isn't. And so they say, oh, wow, yeah, maybe there's evidence. But there isn't. So that's the trick they play. So what are the implications now? I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm assuming. But I've given this talk at a church. I really have. In Indiana, I'm not kidding. Yes, and I'm alive, right? I know. Mike Pence was out of state that day. So I gave that, but they were nice people. I've given this talk to students. A very common reaction we tell them, look, we're pretty confident that there's no soul, is people tend to freak out. They're just like, oh, wow, what's the point of living then? But, et cetera. So a student asked me, well, how do you explain why we fall in love then? It was really sweet. So I had a chat with her. I said, look, here's how it works. It's not the soul. It's not the soul. There's a strong sense in which nothing changes, and I want to use an analogy to show you this. And And to sort of get this, we have to distinguish between facts and explanations. So I know we're supposed to live in a fact-free world, but no, there are facts. Here's a fact. If I were to grab this water bottle here and it's not attached to a cable, there's no powerful magnets and metal in it, and I were to release it, guess what would happen? It would fall to the ground. Now I can have you come up here, you could do the same thing, it would replicate. Lawrence could do it, it would replicate, okay? If the word fact means anything at all in the English language, it's a fact that released objects, barring, cables and whatnot, fall to the ground. Okay, that's a fact. Now, falling apples, whatever. How do we explain this fact? Well, depends when you ask. I mean, explanations go way back. Aristotle had an explanation. It was teleological. The physical objects go back to a natural state. They want to be there, so that's where they go. He was brighter than most of us combined. You laugh now, but he was a smart dude. For about 2,000 years before the scientific revolution, it was him and the Bible, and that was it. So don't laugh. He was a smart guy. In fact, he was remarkably smart. I mean, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Took 2,000 years people to say, look, that's wrong. It took modern science to show that he was wrong. Now, as you know, in the 17th century, 1687, Newton publishes the Principia, and he says, look, here's a new account for why apples, probably a full fake news that it fell on his head. That's the origin of fake news. It's the apple on Newton's head. That's just fake news, I think. But anyway, so Newton came up with a new explanation. He invoked a force that he quantified mathematically. That's a goalless force. Doesn't care what the apple does, and that accounts for planetary motion, the tides, and objects falling. And then a bit later, in the early 20th century, Albert Einstein develops the theory of relativity in 1905 and 1915, and now physicists tell us that gravity is to do with the so-called curvature of space-time. So the explanation has changed, but the facts haven't. Apples still fall to the ground when you release them, okay? So now let's transpose the analogy to people. So what's a comparable set of facts about people? Let's now take adults, and let's take adults who are healthy, have no pathologies. All of us, if we're healthy and have no pathologies, can have a range of thoughts and states of mind and emotions, and we have very flexible behavior. Well, we can do a whole bunch of things. So that's a fact about human beings. It hasn't always been true, because guess what? We evolved from non-human animals who had different cognitive structures and capacities, but it's been true for long enough. So that's a fact about people. Now, what explains this fact about our mental lives and behavior? The answer used to be, we don't have a clue about psychology and biology, so we'll say the soul does it somehow. But we know a bit better now, and so now we've changed the explanation. We say it's not the soul, but it's something having to do with computations in your brain. You see, now, the fact doesn't change. So it would be silly indeed now, wouldn't it, for someone to scream and holler because they discovered that Newton was wrong and fret that their precious material possessions would all of a sudden fly into the sky. That would be silly. Likewise, it would be silly to fret over the demise of the soul. You're still going to fall in love. That's a fact. Doesn't change. It's the explanation that changes. So there's nothing to worry about. For the most part, nothing changes. But of course, everything changes. Because if you remove the soul from the equation, that means that there's a particular kind of free will that is taken away from you. And of course, you're not immortal. You come with a terminal deadline. And when you die, until we learn to download our minds into machines or live forever, then that's it. There's no heaven, no recognizing anybody in heaven. So these are big changes. I'm not going to talk about immortality because you're going to scream when I say this, but I think it's trivial. And I'll tell you why. I mean, it's not something to think much about. I mean, we can, but I think free will is much more important for here and now. It's not trivial, but it's, I think, a little less interesting. So now comes the part where I tell you why it all matters, and I'm going to use the example. See, I have precognition, so I knew that Diane was going to talk about the criminal justice system, and there we go. Now I talk to you about the criminal justice system from a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to give you a sense of the argument first, because it's a little complicated, and then I'm going to show you how it unfolds. So the argument goes something like this. The wrong theories of how the world works often lead to the wrong ideas, the wrong practices, and the wrong policies. So for example, go back to medieval times, the witch theory of causality. Okay, witches are causing all kinds of disasters, so what do? We torture women. Once you realize that there's no such thing as witches, torturing women makes no sense. They had the wrong theory of causation, and they did terrible things. Very rational at the time. If you really believe in witches, it makes sense to eliminate a few women. I'm not advocating that, of course. I'm saying it's rational to save like millions of people from the plague because you made God angry. That's fine. The minute you realize your theory of causality has changed, the practice basically makes no sense, and it's cruel. It turns out that mind-body dualism, so the soul narrative, is the wrong theory of human nature. And so it too can lead to the wrong ideas, practices, and policies. It turns out that certain notions of criminal punishment based on retribution, an eye for an eye, you're a bad apple, I'm going to make you suffer, hinge precisely on that flawed view of human nature, namely dualism. And so, and this is particularly important here in the US because we have a really messed up criminal justice system. I got out of jury duty, by the way, recently. The lawyers asked me, do you have any thoughts about our criminal justice system? I said, yeah, it's the most dysfunctional in the first world. I wasn't invited back. And the lawyer said with a smile, we thank you for your honesty. So if you want to get out of jury duty, that's something, and it happens to be true too, so hey, that's pretty good. I'm not showing the slide anymore? Please? Oh, yeah, that's it. I'm on the next one. I'm fooling you now. Look, so to do this, I have to talk to you about free will. Free will has been discussed for over 2,000 years. I'll solve the problem in about 5 minutes. So I'm not going to solve. I'm going to show you what the problem is. And the best illustration of free will that I've seen, it comes from Dilbert and his smart dog, Dogbert. So Dogbert asked Dilbert, do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? And Dilbert said, of course. Well, then how can we blame people for their actions? You see, it's an insightful dog. Well, because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? No, of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. So you're saying that the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Well, of course, obviously. Otherwise, we couldn't blame people for anything they do. Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up. That, in essence, captures the problem of free will. And it captures an intuition that people have had for a long, long time that is called a particular kind of free will called either libertarian free will or contra-causal free will. And here's a definition from Theopedia, right out of the office of Mike Pence. You're a little slow on that one. Libertarian free will means that our choices are free from the determination or constraints of human nature, and that libertarian freedom is essential for moral responsibility. For if our choices is determined or caused by anything, including our own desires, it cannot be properly called a free choice. Okay? So how does this map out to the real world? We know that our actions and our thoughts are caused by a host of factors, an extraordinarily complex host of factors. The kinds of genes that we have, our life history, the chemistry of our brain, the laws of nature, the environment, etc., etc. But now, if that's all there is, these are causal factors, then we're fully caused. And if we fully caused, then we can't be held morally accountable. This is where the soul narrative comes in. We're told by soul believers that there is a soul, and remember, the soul is psychologically potent, so it has causal powers. It can cause us to do certain things, right? To feel certain things, to do certain things. But it itself, being immaterial, non-physical, is not subject to the laws of nature, so it's not cause. So it is the ultimate uncaused cause. And it's very coherent. It just happens to be wrong. It's very coherent, right? So now, we pesky scientists come along and remove the soul from the equation, That's it. We're fully caused now. But there's a problem, because if we fully caused, then how could we be held morally accountable? So people have this intuition that we're not fully caused. You'll see, if you ask, for example, people here, you tell them there's a boulder, and after a long time it came crashing down the hill, and then you ask them, could the boulder have done otherwise? People say, well, no. The boulder is subject to forces it can't control. Gravity, erosion, what have you. So it did the only thing it could do if you were to rewind the tape. On the other hand, if you take a person now and say it was a troubled youth and he pulled the trigger, could he have chosen to do otherwise if you rewind the tape? Many people say, of course. Well, the answer is no. Why? Because, I'm going quickly over this because I want to reach the end. Because even if he didn't shoot on a reflex and his shooting was preceded by conscious thought, I'm going to shoot you, and pulls the trigger, where do you think that conscious thought comes from? Not from the ether or the soul. It comes from unconscious brain activity in the young person's head. And that unconscious brain activity itself is caused by a host of factors, his genetics, his environment, the laws of nature, over which he has no control. And so there's a full causal chain here that leads all the way back to the Big Bang, probably, to what that guy did. Okay, so now here's the problem from the perspective of soul believers. If you tell us that boulders are fully caused, we don't hold boulders morally accountable. We don't put them on trial for crushing houses. But now you're telling us that people are fully caused too, so how could we be held morally accountable? That's the problem that people seem to think exists. It turns out it's a false problem. It's a false problem because there's no law of nature that says that this, in fact, being fully caused is the relevant dimension. Okay, who says it's a relevant dimension to hang moral responsibility onto? Nobody says that. So can we find another dimension that differentiates boulders and people such that we can pin moral responsibility onto it? The answer is obviously we can. Take, for example, the power of reason. The ability to be consciously aware of the consequences of one's actions, to recognize other beings as moral agents, to have behaviors that can be modified by praise or punishment, etc., or deterred. Well, boulders, so we think, don't have the power of reason, and people do, and that's enough. In fact, that's all the law cares about as far as moral responsibility. I'm going to say something more provocative. I don't think we need that notion anymore, at least in the criminal justice system. Wow, that's shocking, right? But we can talk about this. But if we want it, we have something we can attach it to, and so that's really a false problem. Being fully caused is a false problem. Now, here's where this matters. This is a beautiful paper, by the way. Happy to send it to you. It's really great. It's called For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Nothing and Everything. So that paper discusses two approaches to criminal justice and to punishment. One is a backward-looking approach. So you look back at the moment the person did what they did, and you say, look, they could have chosen to do otherwise, and they didn't. They're bad people. We should punish them, and we should make them suffer. Retribution, an eye for an eye. Now, notice that for that to actually hold, we need to have libertarian intuition. We need to believe somehow that the person could have chosen to do otherwise and was not fully caused. This contrasts with an approach to justice which is forward-looking now, where what we punish people we can't go back and undo the crime, right? So if we have a rapist on the loose, what we try to do is contain them so they don't rape again, right? So forward-looking. That's called a consequentialist approach. Now, for that to be implemented in society, we don't need to hold narrowly to a view of free will that is libertarian. Anything can go, so it's fine. So if science shows that there's a problem with libertarian free will, or that there's a problem with witches, then any approach that hinges upon it basically loses its basis. And so then that means that retribution makes no sense anymore. It makes no sense to punish people to make them suffer. I'm not saying we should let criminals run free. Of course we shouldn't. That's silly. But we shouldn't make them suffer unnecessarily. Okay? As the 18th century materialists would say, that their nature has been bundled. Okay? They have the wrong genes, they grew up in the wrong environment, etc. So here's what the authors conclude in that paper. They say, we maintain that advances in neuroscience are likely to change the way people think about human action and criminal responsibility. Free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion. So contra-causal free will, libertarian free will. Retributivist notions of criminal responsibility ultimately depend on this illusion. And if we're lucky, they will give rise to consequentialist ones, thus radically transforming our approach to criminal justice. At this time, they continue, the law deals firmly, this was a few years ago, but mercifully with individuals whose behavior is obviously the product of forces that are ultimately beyond their control. Someday, the law may treat all convicted criminals this way. That is, humanely. That's beautiful. Darwin wrote about this already in the 19th century, and the materialists of the 18th century already had that insight. Centuries ago. It's beautiful. It matters because, as you heard from Diane yesterday, we have a really messed up criminal justice system. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. We still have the death penalty. It's really bad. Obama at least paid lip service to it, said he wanted to end mass incarceration. Now, with this guy in power, I mean, it's all bets are off. I know. See, you all. Everybody before me had a little Trump joke. It was tepid. I thought I'll push the envelope, and just come on. Let's just right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to summarize now. So what I've tried to tell you, I mean, what I've tried to share with you, the ideas I've tried to share with you is that this notion of the soul is not just a religious or theological notion, but a scientific claim that therefore we can decide objectively whether it's likely to be true or not, that science gives us every reason to believe that it's not true, and that this has implications that fall far beyond the realm of science, and that we have nothing to lose and in fact a lot to gain by letting go of these ideas. So now I want to end with another short video clip that I usually show when I address audiences who are more on the soul end of things, unlike you guys. So let's watch, it's kind of fun, and I think it makes an important point. We have the sound ready, guys, yes? Wonderful, so here we go.
All right, this is an oldie, but, well, it's an oldie where I come from. All right, guys, listen, this is a blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay? Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
So that's what I usually tell people outside of scientific circles when I present these ideas and conclusions. You may not be ready for this yet, but your kids will love it. Thank you very much.
Julien Musolino.
Thank you.
Excellent.